Welcome, spongy Bible brains, to Beach Church in Virginia Beach, our daily Bible devotion. Today marks the beginning of another read and study through the Bible in 1 year. My name is Patrick Malone, and I hope to maintain a spongy brain, soaking in God's word of truth and the scriptures each day. I have the privilege, along with 5 other people from our church, to interpret uh, blocks of 3 and 4 chapters of God's Word each day. We are blessed and we take the responsibility seriously. And we hope you will be edified by what are mostly about 10-minute devotions. Now, today we begin at the beginning with the first 3 chapters of the first book of the Bible, the Old Testament, Genesis. Now, to prepare today, I reviewed introductions in my study Bible, the whole article on how we get the Bible, how to study the Bible, a preface to the New King James Version, which is the translation that I like, an introduction to the Old Testament, an introduction to the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, a description of the harmony of the historic books of the Old Testament, an introduction to the prophets, and of course, an introduction to the book of Genesis. Now, you will be blessed that I'm not going to share any of that information since our time constraints do not allow for it. But I encourage you to get a good study Bible and read similar introductions for yourselves. Let's begin, however, by saying some very brief and basic things about the book of Genesis. It is a book of origins. In the beginning, Moses is the author. Chapters 1 through 11 are primeval history, showing creation and eventually the need for redemption from sin. And then chapters 12 through 50 are what you will call patriarchal history, and it reveals the beginnings of God's plan of redemption from sin through the formation and calling of the nation of Israel to be a light to the Gentiles. And keep in mind, the obvious connection between Genesis, especially chapter 3, about the fall of man into sin that results in a curse against mankind, and link that up at the very end of the book of Revelation when the Apostle John notes that one day there will be no more curse. So this is all about God's plan of redemption. That being said, I assume we know the details of creation and that of mankind in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, and the fall into sin in chapter 3. So I'm going to avoid retelling you what you already know and just point out some interesting observations that may help you read with deeper understanding. So let's jump right in. Here's one. Keep in mind that Moses was inspired to write the first 5 books of the Bible, and that Israelites probably didn't know this information until they were about ready to go into the promised land. In other words, God is, through Moses, giving his people an understanding of their place and calling on the world stage. This is interesting to me because I have never read through the first couple of chapters of Genesis and had in my mind a picture of the Israelites on the plains of Moab waiting to enter the promised land by crossing the Jordan, and how they needed to know this information. That's good context that helps me understand what God's trying to do here. Jump ahead to verses 15 through 19, and it speaks of the 2 great lights, and that they're there to divide the light from the darkness. So it's important that God's people knew that it was God, not some other deity, who created the lights. Keep in mind, originally, Israel had come from Mesopotamia, where the celestial bodies were worshipped, and more recently from Egypt, where the sun up in the sky was worshipped as the primary deity. So God's revealing to them that the very stars and the moons and the planets, which Israel's neighbors had worshipped, were the products of his creation. It's sad and interesting to note that one day in the future, Israel would become themselves worshipers of the hosts of heaven, which led to their being taken captive, and they lost the promised land. All right, here's another one. The pinnacle of God's creation is man, male and female creatures who have a unique relationship with God. What's unique about it? Well, we are able to embody God's communicative attributes. In other words, we have language and speech. No other creatures have that. And in our rational life, we are like God in that we can reason, we have intellect, will, and emotion. And in a moral sense, we were like God before the fall in that we were good and sinless. There's no other creature like us. We're pretty special. Now we get into chapter 2 and we start getting into the details of creation. And I love this. It mentions that man was formed from dirt. Here's an interesting conclusion from that. It seems obvious that a person's value is not in the physical components that form their body, but in the quality of life that forms their souls. We should know that. We know that. How cool is that, though? And then in chapter 2, verse 18, we learn that it's not good for man to be alone, right? Now, the words of the verse emphasize Adam's need for a companion, a helper, an equal. He was incomplete without someone to complement him in fulfilling the task of filling and multiplying and taking dominion over the earth. In other words, this points to Adam's inadequacy, not Eve's insufficiency. Woman was made by God to meet man's deficiency. So pay attention, men. I have to apply this when I really hate admitting to my wife that she was right and I was not. Anyway, you got to apply God's word. All right, and here's a final interesting note to help you read with better understanding these first 3 chapters. All I want to highlight about chapter 3, about the fall of mankind, which one could spend weeks studying about this, okay? But I just want to put in a note of understanding for Adam and Eve. Keep in mind that Eve ate of the apple not because she had decided that God was no longer to be trusted and she was done with that relationship, as though she was angry and felt betrayed, right? She was deceived. She was tricked by the master trickster, the prideful liar himself, the fallen rebellious angel Lucifer, Satan. So cut Adam and Eve some slack in your condemnation of their sin. Interestingly, the term slack is a sailing term, and it refers to loosening a line or a rope from being tight or too tight. Well, thanks be to God that through Jesus, God cuts us some slack of understanding and offers a path of redemption. God has loosened our rope of death by hanging, so to speak, and invited us down off the scaffolding to follow him. Okay, honestly, I'm not sure how I went from eating the fruit of the tree in the Garden of Eden to a scaffold for the execution by hanging, but hopefully you get my drift, which is also a nautical term as its origin is linked to the motion of a boat that is moving along with the current. So before I fall into another colloquial expression requiring explanation, may we all get God's drift reading through the Bible this year and accept the slack he offers through Jesus Christ. All right, brothers and sisters, God bless you. That's it for today.